Welcome to Detroit's Darkest Times. This is your man Slick. Today we're going to get into some stories of robberies in Detroit City in the past that people have committed, that they've done, paid their debt to society, whether they went and did time or during the robbery it cost them their life. So that being said, we're going to get started. This is just history of Detroit robberies. So if you're interested, stay with us and we're going to get started. So the first thing is these are incidents that I've heard of during my time in Detroit. And things of that nature. First thing is in the 80s, there used to be guys that would rob each other. And basically what they would do is they would, like, back then, I don't know if people's familiar with Max Julie jackets, winter coats, and the shoes. Back then, the shoes wasn't nowhere expensive like they are today, but they still had a good price on them. And people would actually shoot people to take their Max Julie jackets and their shoes off their feet. And sometimes they would even take their money out of their pocket. And this is basically street guys that's just basically robbing each other. You know what I mean? And so it was a mess back in the day. And guys would, become friends and then become enemies. And then actually they would, sometimes they would just literally rob each other. And then sometimes they would actually take each other's life over, to me is nonsense, but that's what it was back in the day. Over a jacket, a Max Julie jacket, or some shoes, and then sometimes money, you know. So it was just crazy, these stories, this particular story that I'm talking about, they used to have it on the news and stuff like that. And that's how I'm aware of. But I used to, when I'd watch the news and just see all the stuff that was going on, it used to trip me out, because I just couldn't believe that young guys, some older dudes were doing it too, but, mostly the young cats. And whether it was a stranger or their friend, or sometimes it can even be a family member, you know what I mean? That's how rough it was back in them days. And it was basically just over greed, actually, you know. But, you know, a lot of them cats are no longer around, you know, that was doing that kind of stuff. And the ones who actually survived it, there's some that's around that can tell the story, you know what I mean? But, you know, some was, you know, lucky enough to go to jail and do time and get out and move on with their life. And then there's a whole lot of them. I mean, a whole lot of them that would be killed in the process and things like that, you know. And then back then, the way the operation was going is when, and these are street dudes I'm talking about, you know, that's, uh, the way the operation was going, if they took you out, and you know they would take your jacket or you know your chain or you know whatever you had that was they wanted, they'd take it, but then they would actually take over what you were doing, you know, no matter what you was doing. Like if you was selling whatever you was selling on the streets, they would take it over. And then they would actually, some of them would actually take your vehicle that you was driving, things of that nature, you know. It was just like, you know, the Wild West times 100, you know. And it was just crazy, you know. And then they would also go around and just, you know, besides robbing people, they would actually, and this is really, if you think about it, this is really a robbery too, if you think about why it happened. But they would actually go around and take people out in the neighborhood that was, you know, maybe hurting their business or something like that, or they wanted their business or something like that. You know, they would actually be doing that and stuff. And this was all over the news, you know, in the 80s and 90s, stuff like that. But it was just, and I'm only speaking for Detroit City, but, you know, I'm sure that went on in a lot of big cities, what I'm talking about. But I'm just, from my experience of hearing things and watching the news and things like that, what was going on in my time. And that's why I decided to do this audio to just let people know a little bit of history of Detroit City and what I have heard and things like that. But even a dude had got killed in a phone booth with a shotgun, stuff like that. So it was really pretty chaotic, you know. And some of the names, if you look them up, you can, you know, if you look up like Maserati Rick and the Young Boys Incorporated and things like that, once you pull them names up, you'll get some other names too that was from Detroit City around the way. And you could just see the stories and stuff like that, that what was actually going on, you know. And then, and like I said, it was like the Wild West times 100. Because, you know, they would just rob people, take their, you know, jewelry, their jackets, or shoes off their feet, their car, to take over their business, what kind of business they were doing on the street. And, you know, just regular, you know, regular street dudes that was just ill with the game, you know what I mean? And so, you know, a lot of them, like I said, a lot of them did make it through, you know, because they lived that kind of life. and you live that kind of life, each day you wake up, you don't know if you're coming back home or not. You know what I mean? And and a lot of them didn't come back home. You know, and then there was some that was lucky enough to get caught and go to jail and do their time, get out, and doing legit stuff today. You know what I mean? And just trying to make a legit dollar instead of the other way around. So all these stories that I was taking in as I was coming up in Detroit City, it was just crazy. And that's a popular word on Detroit's Darkest Times channel, is that's crazy. So that we might add that to our logo, because that was crazy. You know what I mean? And just crazy incidents happen. And back then, there would be people, they would hold up gas stations, they would hold up grocery stores. It was just crazy the way things were going on back in the day. And they would rob Shell gas stations and liquor stores and just all kind of. And then sometimes people would get robbed straight off the street. So it just depended on what the situation was. So in them days, you had to really watch what you was doing, and you had to pay attention of your surroundings, and there was just certain places you go and certain places you didn't go. And I'm sure that's in every big city, you know what I mean? But I'm just talking about Detroit City in itself back in the day. And everybody just wanted, you might as well say everybody just wanted the quick buck. You know what I mean? And even it just moved up to, uh, government officials and all that. You know what I mean? That's how deep it got. And the city mayor actually, him and his crew was actually robbing the city of Detroit. And they did so much damage in Detroit that they ended up having to file bankruptcy, because they literally running out of money to operate the city. So when the government gets involved, they're going to do an investigation and find out what's the problem, the reason y'all ain't got money to run the city. And then through the investigation, you can look this up, it's public record. And through the investigation, they find out that they were just spending all kind of money on themselves, basically. And money that didn't belong to them, but they had authority to take care of the city, and they failed horribly. And a lot of the people in Detroit City kind of paid the price for them doing the robberies that they were doing. And it was just crazy. And but eventually the investigation took place. And, well, before the investigation takes place, these cats literally run out of money to operate the city before they file a bankruptcy. So then you got a lot of places that's just closing the doors because your employees are not getting paid, you not getting paid, and people just ain't gonna keep going to work without a paycheck. So there's some spots in Detroit City, like police stations, just funeral homes, just different places that actually just closed the doors and everybody left. Now, when I say that, I want you to get a picture of what's really going on. Because a lot of times in Detroit City, there was a lot of people that were doing robberies, not just the mayor and his crew. And you know what I mean? There was a lot of other people doing it too. But everybody didn't get caught, for that matter. But that's part of the reason that a lot of these places closed down and shut their doors, because they was involved in, scamming money and stuff like that. So that's the reason they closed some police stations. And I'm talking about close the doors and everything's still in there. And it just rotted away. And it it was different places: courthouse, police station, fire department. I mean, just a whole lot of stuff. And there was just no more money to run the operation or to pay people. So this is what the people decided to do. But some of the people was corrupted, involved in, scamming money and stuff like that. And a lot of people did that in Detroit City back in the day. It was just a whole lot of corruption going on. A lot of people didn't get caught. A lot of people did get caught. It's just basically what that was. And it's public knowledge, so you want to look it up, you can. But it was just really a mess. And on funeral homes, I believe they were doing the same thing, scamming money and stuff like that, because they would take money for services and then they wouldn't provide any services. And at some funeral homes, they actually closed their doors, everything in the funeral home. Years passed, because if anybody that knows about Detroit City, they know about all the abandoned houses and abandoned buildings that was here at once upon a time, but some of them ain't up on this about the police stations and the funeral homes and the courthouse and all this other stuff. And but anyways, the funeral homes close. They leave everything in there. And at funeral homes, you got people's ashes that people had, their family cremated, stuff like that. All that's in the funeral home. And I want to speak on this one funeral home. I ain't going to say the name of it, but you can Google what I'm talking about and you can get all the information, because this is, from back in the day. It's all public record. And like I said, everybody's paid the price, whether they went to jail for it or they lost their life for it, or whatever. Everybody's paid the price for the robberies that went down back in the day in Detroit City. But anyways, at the funeral home, they left, like I said, they just shut the door. Everything's in the funeral home. The caskets, the urns, the ashes, people's family members, all kinds of stuff. And you might think this is crazy, but this is a real deal. You can look it up if you don't believe it. And so they closed the doors years later. These places are just corrosion and rotting away, basically. So years later, the urban explorers, and this, I don't remember exactly what year the urban explorers started, but, you got Google today, you can find out all that information. But anyways, urban explorer from Detroit. He decides he's going to go and explore all the abandoned schools and the police stations, the funeral homes, and all that. And this is, basically illegal to do because he's just like trying to film and take pictures and basically on a YouTube channel. And he's doing that. Well, he's doing that before he actually gets the YouTube channel, but he takes the pictures of, abandoned schools, police stations, funeral homes, things of that nature. And he shows, you can look it up and see all this, what I'm talking about. He shows everything that's left behind. It's people's records in the police department, weapons that they recovered, just all kinds of stuff that they just left behind, And then he did a funeral home, and he explored it. And after that, I think some good time later, he did the funeral home, but he looked through the whole funeral home and stuff like that, and he seen all the stuff that was left behind, and it was crazy, But years later, some people had went in there. I guess the families were complaining about they paid that funeral home for services, and then the next thing they knew, the funeral home actually closed the doors, and then they just never heard from them anymore. So they had went in, some people had went in to check the funeral home. Then they found the ashes of people's family and stuff like that. Then they actually found mummified babies up in the ceiling. So this is just really a nightmare at a funeral home. But anyways, these people, and this is what I'm talking about the robbery situation. People were, taking money to cremate people and all that. And, then I guess they decided they would just take the money and quit doing it. And then you got a body that you got to try to get rid of. So these people were just putting mummified infants up in the ceiling. And this is public record. You can look it up on YouTube. It was just a crazy time back in them days, And same with the courthouse, same with the jails and all that. They just closed the doors and everybody left. And this wouldn't be known, actually, if this urban explorer from Detroit didn't go and actually, he basically was, trespassing because he went in these places, with the video. First he did with camera, then he did with video. And it was just crazy. But when he heard about the mummified babies at the funeral home, he remembered that he was at that funeral home, but he didn't look up in the ceilings or anything like that. So he said after all that blew over, he went back to the funeral home to do another video, after it's all said and done. But by this time, everybody's got their ashes to their family members, was actually made sure they got to the correct family and stuff like that. And then I'm sure they had the funeral for the mummified babies, and all that. They got done properly. And this is years down the road, But if it wasn't for that urban explorer guy, and I know his name. It just ain't coming to me. But you can look up Detroit abandoned buildings and just start looking on that, and you'll see the guy that I'm talking about, the urban explorer guy that explores the abandoned schools and the police stations and hospitals and abandoned buildings and all that. And it's really interesting what all the stuff he captures. And but nobody would know about this if this cat didn't, actually trespass and go into these places and take the pictures and do the video and everything like that. So I felt like I needed to do this audio because this is some things that like I said, I've seen it on the news, I've seen it on, YouTube. I've experienced hearing about different things in the city of Detroit at the time when I was coming up. So it's just all that, wrapped into one. You know what I mean? And some people when you tell the stories like this, some people find it hard to believe. That's why I recommend that you do look anything I'm talking about. You look it up on Google and on YouTube and stuff like that, and you'll see more of the story on them platforms. But in that time, though, back then, everybody was just trying to figure out a way, no matter if they had a legit business or whatever they were doing, street, or if they was just, had business on the street or whatever, they would always figure out a way to get money more than what was actually coming in regularly. You know what I mean? So it was just something basically, because and then after the mayor and his friends robbed the city, it was a big thing on the news, in the papers, everything. Then the Board of Educations in Detroit City, they decide they're going to do the same thing. They're going to try to use money, that the government funds to keep schools operating and stuff like that, taxpayer money, things like that. They're going to decide they want to, make more money than what their paycheck is, and basically just another robbery. And this robbery takes place through the Board of Education in Detroit at the time. And then they do investigation on them, find out there's a lot of corruption, they stealing money, living off the money, stuff like that. They even found a warehouse that had a bunch of motorcycles in it, a bunch of BlackBerry phones in it. And these people were buying this kind of stuff. And I don't know why they did, it's kind of stupidity if you ask me, because they're stealing money, they're robbing money from the Board of Education. Kids that's going to school in Detroit City at the time is getting the worst education you could think of, if any. And you got all them abandoned schools. They won't tear them down because they're acting like they're still in operation so they can get the government funding. But all this come tumbling down, through the investigation. Then they figured out what they was all doing, So basically, everybody was robbing everybody, to be honest with you. It was just chaotic, but all the kids in Detroit City trying to get an education was having such a bad time during that time. And, and then, it was just, it's unspeakable what was going on back in the day. You know what I mean? And you can also look up, the Board of Educations in Detroit, things like that, and see the history of Detroit, you know, and you can see all what I'm talking about, because if I was just doing this audio and you didn't have internet, most people would not even believe the story. You know what I mean? But now that you got internet where you can, fact check people and stuff like that, then you can see the kind of stuff that went on, And it was just, like I said, the Wild West times 100 in Detroit City back in them days, And it was crazy, but there was just so many robberies going on at the time. People were, I had a friend that worked at a Shell gas station on Warren and Trumbull in Detroit City. And he told me that sometimes it had a mechanic garage to it, and then they would, fix people's cars and stuff like that. And a lot of times people would drop their car off, they would fix it, and then when they got ready, they would call the people to come back and get the car. But, they would have to, I think they only had like 2 bays, might have been 3, but anyways, once they get the car fixed, they had to pull it in the parking lot of the Shell gas station. And then they would call the people to come and get it. But before the people would come and get it, somebody would steal the car out of the gas station parking lot. And it was just crazy. He used to tell me stories like that. And, I just heard so many different stories about things like that in the city, whether it be on the news or somebody telling me, or, I have seen, robberies actually too. So, it's just either or, it's just a hellacious time back in them days, But like I said, a lot of people had to pay the price trying to get the quick buck. A lot of people went to prison.